So now we want to spend a little bit of time talking about what interest groups do. And we already get a sense. We talked about the idea that interest groups are trying to get members to join their group, and so they have to spend time and money and resources doing that. But we also want to spend our time thinking about what other activities interest groups do in our political system. Um, and so the textbook finds it useful to divide the techniques used by interest groups into two different categories. And again, this categorization is not perfect, but it's one that helps us isolate some important distinction. And that's where the distinction between the inside game and the outside game. The inside game is the idea of lobbying, is the idea of interest groups hiring individuals to go and try to influence the policy legislation by going to the House and to the Senate and to try to get the Congress to pass legislation or to stop passing legislation. Executive branch, because if a bill has been passed, it still matters how that's actually implemented. So if in fact there's some environmental protection laws that have been passed, it matters how in fact the fines are levied, the ways in which the government finds out whether or not some company is putting in gloppity glop or schloppity schlop and things like that from the Lorax. It really depends on the actual implementation of it. So the executive branch might be the place to go if you have a particular concern about the ways in which environmental protection laws are being implemented. Or it might be a court case that needs to be done. You need to take the government to court arguing that itself is unconstitutional, or the way in which they're doing it is discriminatory or contradictory in some ways. Or you need to go to separate states to be able to influence it. If the concern is what's going on in California, these things need to be done in California or in Texas or in Pennsylvania or other states. And so in many ways, the idea is one that we most obviously think of in terms of writing the legislation or stopping legislation from passing, but it can also be influencing even after it's passed and talking about the executive branch, or it can be challenging the legality of it or the constitutionality of it in the courts, or it can be going to the different states. And so again, it's a reminder that interest groups and the idea of pluralism is put into place and given considerable amount of power in our political system because to have separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Dividing up the power creates more access points for interest groups. The way to think of it is it created a system where groups that have the resources, who have real resources, don't have to take no for an answer. They can keep shopping around until they get the answer that they want. And it costs quite a bit of money to do that. It's not something that's done cheaply. And so certain groups can afford to play this game more. In that sense, the inside game, this lobbying of influencing policy as directly as possible, is what all interest groups would like to do. But some groups can afford it and some groups can't. So the inside game is, for example, that the Sierra Club or Energy Corporation or an interest group that's talking about oil exploration, that they will meet with senators or members of the House of Representatives or members of the executive branch and talk over lunch that the interest groups and the lobbyists are going to pay for to talk about legislation. And in fact, it can go even further than that. A lot of times, the legislation or parts of the legislation that are actually introduced into Congress were written by interest groups. Because, and this is an important point that the textbook points out and we want to be clear about, is that, yes, there is often an exchange of resources, that there's a nice meal that the lobbyists will pay for a senator or for a member of the House of Representatives, or they'll have a nice trip they get to go on. So there is certainly an exchange that way. There's a threat sometimes, or a promise, depending on which way they want to go, in terms of campaign contributions. That if in fact this legislator is willing to stop this bill or pass this bill or act in favor of what this interest group wants, then maybe they would be likely to support and give some money to their campaign when they're running for re-election. And so that is an implied talking about an exchange of resources, absolutely. But a lot of what is actually done is an exchange of ideas, an exchange of information that the senators, the members of the House of Representatives, aren't necessarily experts in the banking policy, in the environmental policy, in the energy policy, and things like that. And the members of the interest groups are experts. The problem is that they're experts in a particular way. They already know the answer ahead of time. So they are not necessarily going to provide all the information. They're going to provide the information that will benefit their members as much as possible. But the House and the Senate and the executive branch and the judges do rely considerably on an exchange of information that interest groups can provide. Their expertise is important. And we would like to have it. It actually is important because the members of these interest groups are going to be impacted by the laws. And so in that sense, it is important to do that. But the inside game is directly trying to influence the legislation, to influence the policy once it becomes a law, to challenge it in courts, to go to the different states to influence it there as well. All of that is the inside game. It's a member of Congress who is approached by the corporation, an interest group that's representing those corporations that are dealing with oil exploration, and hearing from them the terrible ways in which getting rid of the subsidies for oil exploration would make the world a terrible place. Because from the perspective of the oil companies, they think that it'll be a terrible place. They also know it'll be a terrible place for them. So in that sense, the information that's exchanged is not perfect, it's not unbiased. There's certainly clear sources of bias that are there, but that information is important. The other game that's played is the outside game, and that's mobilizing the grassroots. It's pointing out that sometimes what a group really can bring to the table are a large number of people who care about a particular interest. And so the outside game is one that can often be really creative. You can think of it in terms of street theater. You can think about it in terms of having a really cool march on the mall, or a whole group of marches and protests, as was done, talking about the challenges to the policies of the United States government on the border and the separation of families, of immigrant families. That there have been a number of vigils that were held, protests that are held, and things like that. And they're often very creative in the way in which they do it. And that is an important thing. And it can influence the activities of Congress or the executive branch, the judicial branch, of state governments, and things like that. But it's not as direct as the inside game. And so a lot of groups would like to be doing the inside game if they could afford it. The inside game is clearly expensive. Just think about the nice clothes and the expense account and the shoes and all of the things that lobbyists charge to do their services. And so in that sense, some groups would love to be able to participate in that game, but they're not, because the inside game is more effective than the outside game. And the outside game takes longer, it's not as clear cut. The inside game is one that is more successful if you can afford it. And then that leads to the other one, which is pretty obvious, but which groups have more influence in American politics? Your textbook is pretty clear that it's business corporations, either individually or banding together for the Chamber of Commerce or for other interest groups to be able to influence the activities of government officials, to be able to get things, to allow them to have tax subsidies, to stop legislation that would actually increase their tax burden, and all of those things. Those business corporations have more resources available to them. It allows them, and that inside game is more effective because it is more direct influence over government policy. The other thing the textbook points talking about throughout the course is that there is also support in the United States for the idea of the free enterprise system. We think of these corporations as job creators. We think of the economy as being healthy because our unemployment rate is quite low and the stock market is doing well. That's only one measure of the economic health of our country. There are ways in which the distribution of wealth is not nearly as healthy as it should be, and a number of you actually explored that in some of the papers that you wrote, and you're right to do so. But the groups that are most successful are those groups that represent these business corporations, these business interests. They're much more successful. And the fact that they're more successful than other groups points out the way in which pluralism may be necessary. Pluralistic democracy may be necessary because majoritarian democracy in and of itself is going to lead a lot of gaps. But at the same time, there are gaps created by a pluralist system, and that is one of economic and political inequality. And since political equality is an important component of democracy, that is a challenge to the idea of democracy.